Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this, welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Cal Naranya, and minor correction, last week was episode 89. This week is episode 90. On this week's episode, I will be reviewing If, John Krasinski's new film starring Ryan Reynolds about imaginary friends, and Season 1 of X-Men 97. There will be a non-spoiler and spoiler section of the review for If. There will only be a spoiler review for X-Men 97. Don't worry, timecodes will be listed in the description. Given how it's the older thing to have finished or / concluded, let's jump into X-Men 97 Season 1 review.
Downstairs, now!
What the heck is going on?
Haven't you figured it out? We're in hell!
Alright, starting off the review of X-Men 97, I quite enjoyed this season a lot. I did talk about the first 2 episodes of the podcast with Rob Keyes, so make sure to go back and check that out. When it comes to Season 1 of this, I don't want to just get caught up in the hype for this show. It's been a lot of discussion on the return to the Marvel shared universe of the 1990s, which was a big deal when I was growing up. You had your Batman the Animated Series, X-Men, Spider-Man, the lesser successful Iron Man, Fantastic Four, and Hulk very briefly. And then later on there was an Avengers with none of the main Avengers. There's probably going to be people already upset with me because I really did enjoy this show. But there are substantial caveats to how much I enjoyed this show. Now, when it comes to the story, ultimately, I really enjoyed what was covered in Season 1 as a whole. Pacing being something that's been a lot of discussion. If you're listening to this on release day, it's almost been a week since it came out, as I've said. So I've had time to process. This story, in particular in Season 1, really does put the X-Men through the ringer. I know Bo DeMeo really talked about, particularly with Remember It, Episode 5 being the one submitted to the Emmys, and this is not something I don't think he said lightly, which was, it was essentially a 9/11 level event for the late 90s version of the X-Men the Animated Series. Them being similar to Batman the Animated Series and that element of the DC Animated Universe, the definitive version of these characters for a lot of people, and there was a lot of nostalgia goggles going into this. I think it's affected some of the perception. I've had some interactions on Twitter about criticism, particularly for the animation in this show, and I don't think it's very good. This has been something that has been bothering me more frequently as I've watched more and more US-based animation or cartoon series, whether it's Invincible, Legend of Vox Machina, and then this show, which is the character models in still frames or no motion required when they are just standing still look absolutely incredible. But the in-betweens, getting them to their action poses at times feels very stilted. I don't know if this is because of the fusion of cell animation and 3D, but whatever the rendering process is being used for this show, I find a lot of the characters in motion moving in 3-dimensional space. Of course, they're 2-dimensional objects, but they move in a way that they are not to make it look more realistic. At times, you can really see the limitations of what I'm assuming was a lesser budget on an animated product, this being the baby of something that Kevin Feige wanted to bring back to Disney+. His 2 main caveats being he needed the cast and the theme song. One element that certainly did carry forward, as I mentioned already, is the level of storytelling. My favorite aspect of X-Men the Animated Series was its such superior adaptations of mainstay comic book events that, unfortunately, the Fox live action films failed to do. They attempted to do the Dark Phoenix saga 3 times, while these shows managed to do things like Days of Future Past, that being something that the movies did do well, but also Dark Phoenix being executed well and integrating a lot of the expanded lore of the X-Men universe that the films failed to do, whether that was going to far-off planets, getting to see other villains outside of Magneto, Apocalypse, of course, being horribly adapted in X-Men Apocalypse, as well as exploring other characters and having more mainstay X-Men, not Wolverine just being the focus. Of course, he is one of the leads of this show, but something I really did appreciate in X-Men 97 is giving a focus to the original X-Men, in particular, that being Scott and Jean Grey, as well as Hank's relationship, and again, diving into the one that we see with Charles and Eric with that Magneto Professor X relationship, the mainstay of the franchise that, quite frankly, was always done successfully in the live-action films. What holds this from being something that I think is definitive or the best thing we've seen from Marvel is that the animation does not hold up. The pacing of the story, while be it I loved what we got from the story, it did feel like we were moving at a clip where all of the Madeline Pryor story, which I was not super familiar with, I've read a little bit about it, but where all of that is wrapped in one episode, it felt like, and this to some degree kind of does make sense, where Bo, the showrunner for the first 2 seasons, and you can look up whatever happened with that and his departure from the series, says that he based a lot of this off of fan scripts he had written when he learned to be a screenwriter after seeing the first X-Men film. And I get that, and some of those elements kind of feel relevant to how the story is ultimately laid out. We're in full spoilers, so again, if you haven't seen the series yet, duck out now. But I feel like you could have had an entire season of Magneto as the head of the X-Men and slowly seeing what that really does do to his relationship with the X-Men, or what he remembers of his relationship with Charles, even though we know, or they know and we know, he's not actually dead. He's with the Shi'ar. What could that mean, and how the tension that builds in this world feels to happen very quickly. This is why, and Jermaine, I know you asked me about this, and it's something I've said, which is the way that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has established its world, I don't feel that the X-Men fit or make any sense, given the hero worship to some degree that we've seen. We, of course, did have the Sokovia Accords, and it might have made more sense for them to fit in there. I had a fan theory, and that's all it is, that the quicker way to integrate them and what could have led to the prejudice that the mutant population faces in the Marvel Comics universe is that we learn in Endgame that there is gamma radiation or a similar kind of radiation that emits from the Infinity Stones when they are all used together. And bringing back, wiping out half of the population of the universe, particularly on Earth, but then bringing them back with another dose of that radiation could have supercharged a percentage of the population. What would that have led to, where you have people showing up with powers, potentially people being born with powers? It's likely to assume that there were pregnant women that were snapped out of existence, and then you could have had a logical explanation for the prejudice with already people being blipped back or snapped back into existence, and what that dynamic would have been for the universe. Obviously, that's not what they're going to explore, but prejudice towards people just born with powers doesn't really fit on, I mean, Kevin Feige calls it this, so I will, just for the sake of argument, Earth 616, which is not what the movie universe is. It's a separate universe. Mainstay comic book universe is 616. But let's get back to the X-Men the Animated Series universe / the Marvel TV shared animated universe. That's a terrible acronym, and I'll think of probably one later. Bastion as a main villain, who was teased throughout the show, was really interesting. Something that the X-Men universe and comics and films to some degree have managed to do so successfully is talk about xenophobia, prejudice. You literally have all of the villains being afraid of people that are different. And for one, unfortunately, an element that the films fail to always address, which is having a multicultural cast for the X-Men. In particular with this, obviously you're going to have a lot of different leads, but giving Storm a compelling story that I liked a lot of the throwbacks to stuff like Man of Steel, particularly when she gets her powers back. But again, that story could have been done for longer and is almost wrapped up on the side, which is really interesting. The most interesting dynamic that I enjoyed was the exploration between the relationship between Scott Summers and Jean Grey. Her not knowing which of the Jeans or Madeleines she was during the events is not necessarily, I think, something you need to answer because of the way that that dynamic is established and how it evolves, devolves, and revolves around what's gone on, particularly with Nathan's birth leading to Cable and the interactions that they're able to have because of a lot of the substantial science fiction elements that the X-Men universe can have are awesome, and I love that. Did I love watching this show? There's going to be people who are thinking I'm being really nitpicky. As somebody who loved the mid-90s, early 90s era of kids' television action programming, I did love going back to this world because the care taken with this universe, it's clearly one that was present when the original creators were working on the show. So I'm really hoping that we do get to see more of it. I liked how they got to explore other dynamics, particularly an introduction of Morph, making that character non-binary makes absolute sense. It's something I brought up in my discussion with Rob when we talked about episodes 1 and 2. More specifically, what I'm very curious about is given where we do see the characters end up being in the different timelines or different times throughout the universe, and a substantial tease for 2 different parts of Apocalypse Story. I was yelling at my TV. Oh my goodness! Now I forgot. I remembered his name when I said it. El Sabanur. That's what it is. Apocalypse. I gotta look that up. Yeah. En Sabanur. Sorry. Wrong letter sound. But there are a lot of things teased, particularly with the return of Gambit. Quite frankly, as much as he's a fan favorite character, having significant deaths, characters stay dead. I know it's a common convention. Nobody stays dead in comics. The stories are more impactful, though, if they do stay dead. Yes, there are some DC ones that have been cool, but for the most part, I love Gambit. The thing that I loved most about this show existing, you could argue coming back, but it is substantially different to some degree, is that it's reminded me how much I've missed the X-Men. The last X-Men film, technically, was when? Let's look this up real quick. I should know this off the top of my head, but I can't remember. So the New Mutants, it was in 2020, and that film had a substantial amount of delays. So it's been 4 years, almost full 4 years because it was in August, since we've seen the X-Men. Obviously, we're going to be seeing Deadpool and Wolverine, some version of the MCU, some version. I said version a lot, or some, what do they call them? Not variants. Do they call them variants? I honestly can't remember because of the way that the multiverse has been explained so many different ways in the Marvel Cinematic Universe of Wolverine and how they're going to bring him into the story, not being the Logan we've seen before because of although there are similarities to the film Logan, but that Rob brought it up when we discussed it for 1 and 2 that this is good for the X-Men, and to some degree I do agree with his sentiment, in particular with revitalization and bringing eyes to the brand and everybody's excitement. I'm really enjoying a lot of the fan casting. I do think that Glenn Powell would be a great Cyclops, and really showing him as this capable leader and showing that it's not laser vision that he has, that it's concussive energy, which is like it has force as opposed to heat melting abilities. So that was really cool. I think a lot of the stakes established in this were significant. Again, establishing the relationships that have been created beforehand and really driving them forward and exploring some serious I said serious twice. Serious adult themes is an element of animation that I really appreciate. I have not watched this with my kids, particularly because it's on the more violent end, and I don't think necessarily that they would be ready. I've already mentioned Remember It, but if that is a conclusion to a character like Gambit, you cannot give him a better one, especially with the cataclysm that what it leads to for the conclusion. I do think that was a little rushed, especially because we focus on such other villains. Moving Mr. Sinister to the side and being a side character working under Bastion does ultimately work because he's typically a character from the shadows, establishing the other Marvel characters we've seen throughout the universe. We see Alpha Force, we see Doctor Strange, we even see Daredevil and Spider-Man the Animated Series, and I know there's all this love for it. I just don't have it. It's a show I've rewatched within the last decade, and I would much rather Spectacular Spider-Man come back. I'm sorry. Please put your pitchforks away. I get everybody's excitement about the Marvel Television Shared Universe, the Mushu. Mutashu. It's the Mutashu now. That's what I'm calling it moving forward. Is awesome. It's good that this show revitalization, reboot, whatever you want to call it, has established where the story is going to be going moving forward. I guess one thing I haven't talked about before concluding my review of season 1 is that I think most of the voice recasting or brought back characters work. The one for me that doesn't, and this is not a criticism, but it's just when you have an ear for these iconic versions of the characters, it's when it's not on and it's not in the same spot, at least that I hear it. I love Ross Marquand, but the Charles doesn't work for me. A lot of the other recastings do, but unfortunately that one I found quite distracting. Everybody else worked, and Ross Marquand has done amazing work in other things. Going to Marvel, what he did as Red Skull in Infinity War and Endgame was absolutely incredible. I really did like this show. I'm really excited about seeing where it goes, with them being a plan and a show Bible running for 4 seasons. Revitalization of these canceled or ended shows because of the multiverse is something I'm excited about. I'm hoping James Gunn does the exact same thing moving forward, which Young Justice, I've got the 3 seasons to my left. Season 4 is unavailable on Blu-ray, unfortunately, which is super annoying, and I would love to see that show return to. If we do get Spider-Man the Animated Series, that would be cool, given how we got to see some elements of those, but I'm not going to lie, I kind of liked Spider-Man Unlimited when it did come out, even though you can argue if it's canon or not to Spider-Man the Animated Series. I did like it. I didn't love it, I think, as much as everybody else. I would still recommend it, even if you are a fan of X-Men in general and you didn't watch the animated series. I haven't rewatched that nearly as much as I have with the DCAU, but it's a great reintroduction to this particular version of the X-Men, probably the most popular one outside of the movies, so it's definitely worth checking out on Disney+. Not an ad, but that's where you can watch it. Alright, that will do it for my Season 1 review of X-Men 97. Let's jump into my non-spoiler thoughts on John Krasinski's latest film, If.
What happened? Well, she was putting that creepy doll to sleep. She stopped. She looked up. She definitely felt something. So I slowly walked over to her, and as I got close,
Alright, John Krasinski's made a film that is designed for families, which is different than his previous work with The Quiet Places, which I did really enjoy. This is non-spoilers, so there's going to be a lot of generalities in particular. I want to start off with how the film was marketed, because quite frankly, that affected my viewing experience. Obviously, you can see in the trailers this idea of imaginary friends, and this little girl can see them. Why she can see them is addressed in spoilers, which I will get to. But what John Krasinski has said, for this film, he wanted to make a live-action Pixar film. Now, in the film world, that is similar to when a franchise is approaching its sequel and you hear this is going to be the Empire Strikes Back of the universe, or The Godfather Part 2. That's probably used less, but I would argue that's not a good thing when you are trying to market your film. Those are great buzzwords, but comparisons are unfortunately always drawn. This film, If, while fun and heartwarming, is not nearly as well executed as a Pixar film. Maybe a Cars, and that's not to be a shot at either of those, but Pixar has set a bar as arguably the most prestigious, critically and audience reviewed, family friendly films of all time. And so that's the bar you're setting for yourself. There's a lot of expectations, and unfortunately for me, those were not met. I enjoyed the film. I think it's fun. I like seeing Ryan Reynolds and the colorful characters. We don't get to really know many of them outside of some really fun cameos to some degree, and the ensemble that was assembled for this film is cool to hear, and it's kind of fun to determine who they are if you don't know who everybody is. Some of them surprised me and some of them didn't. But the movie is, and this is not to be a criticism of the film itself. Well, it is and it isn't, which is that the movie is fine, which is not a problem. Not every movie is going to be an Oscar winner or an incredible comedy or the scariest movie you've ever seen. But as I've mentioned just now, in the marketing for this film, the category of films that John wanted it to be considered in fails to meet that bar. And I thought the film was fun. I did enjoy it. The message is nice. Overall, it's not his best movie by any means, and that to me was the most disappointing factor, which is John Krasinski as a director. And I'm not somebody, if you're a longtime listener, you know this, who enjoys horror more. I would say I enjoy a thriller more than I do a horror film. But he might have had better execution if he was not directing, writing, starring, which was not something that I knew. I mean, the poster behind me, his name's on it, but I hadn't really even thought about it. To be honest, the poster didn't go up till I started recording for this episode. And so you can see a lot of the elements that he was likely inspired by. There's been a lot of discussion on the internet about Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, which cannot be ignored. It is very similar to what this idea is. I think it's broad enough of an idea that he probably wasn't sued for it, but it is shocking to claim to have this idea be as original as it is when it's not. But there's a lot of ideas and there's only so many under the sun. But ultimately, I think I've said ultimately too many times in this episode. I apologize. It's the end of a long weekend. I liked Ryan Reynolds with Kaylee Fleming. Their chemistry is great. Kaylee Fleming is somebody I'd be very curious to see what she does moving forward. Her most notable role I'm seeing here was young Rey in the Star Wars films, which is really cool. Oh, I completely forgot she was in Peppermint. I'm just looking at her wiki. And she's really good in this and has some very emotional scenes. And that being her relationship with a couple of her family is the crux of the film, and something I can get into spoilers, which was heavily inspired by one Pixar film in particular. But the irony to me is, wow, that Pixar film is regarded as being something very special. It has a really incredible 15 minutes, and I think the zaniness of the film kind of undercuts that as the film goes on. If you know what movie I'm talking about, you know what movie I'm talking about. But if you don't, we can discuss further in spoilers. So I liked the movie, but I think my biggest problem is that it's forgettable, and its message is not something that's overly unique, and the way that it is delivered, it's not a way in which you're going to have this aha, oh my god, this is so cool that the way that they managed to do this. This is a really hard film to talk about because it's not bad, but it's not great, and it's not so bad I can make fun of it. Not that that's something I like to do. I like to think when you're listening to the Film Realist podcast, I bring in honestness,
which one?
honesty,
Damn well which one.
But looking for the bright spots in the movie,
really
which I
means
can
a whole
kind of
lot.
explain more so in spoilers. The comedy for this is funny. The design of it is really interesting. It is cool to see these characters of the imaginary friends throughout a real world universe. You get to play up with Ryan Reynolds and a child. It's one of my favorite elements of the Adam Project. He's somebody who bounces really well off of kids, and that part is really entertaining. But I don't think this is going to be a movie that people are going to be recommending very often. It's unfortunate because there's been this cry for original films in cinemas. A lot of people have a lot less disposable income now because of the inflation and whatnot, and people are typically, as you can check by the box office numbers, more likely to go to something that's recognizable. Even though there's this complaint about remakes, reboots, and sequels, this is an original idea, but this is not one necessarily that I think is going to make people feel like they have to see it. Similar to The Fall Guy, which is something I would recommend more over this. This will probably do really well on streaming for families. The theater that I saw it in did not have a ton of people. It's a fun enough idea, but I think because the idea is not overly original and the cinematography and filmmaking is not something that's going to blow your mind, or going to be one of those films similar to something like Elemental, which, even though it was Pixar, the way that it was doing different things and that story about first generation immigrants and their children and their relationship with the economics of the city that they're lived in, those are really big things to be putting into a kids film. And I don't say kids film to be insulting, but Pixar obviously more aimed at children and families, that this movie's gonna just sort of go away. The irony being that it's going to likely be forgotten, similar to what happens with the imaginary friends in the movie. It's fun, it's harmless, it's certainly better than an Illumination film, but if we're gonna compare it to the category of kids films, you're aiming for Pixar. I would say this is probably on the lower end of a DreamWorks movie. I wouldn't say Illumination. I don't want to be that mean. So I'm kind of left with nothing much to say because there wasn't a ton that I loved about it. There was nothing that I hated, but it's a good movie, but all of its parts have been done better by other movies or other television shows. So it's fine. I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. It's just, it's a movie, and it's not one that I think many people are going to be discussing moving forward, which probably explains its reception and its opening weekend. So that's all I can really say. I'm going to jump into spoilers to where I can dive into what doesn't work, but what does really work for me. So let's jump into spoilers where I can thoroughly explain all of the elements of John Krasinski's If. All right, I'm just going to start with the Pixar film that this movie quite literally steals its beginning from is Up, where we are introduced to Bee, her mom, her dad, and her grandmother in an apartment in New York, and there's all this fun of them playing around, and it's very heartwarming. Yeah, it's very heartwarming. And then the mother gets sick and she dies, which would be interesting if the film established all of these relationships, which was the benefit of the beginning in Up, where we got to see that whole life that Carl had with his wife and her death, them not having kids, where it's a montage of them having fun together and then her dying, which is sad. But again, if you're going to compare yourself to Pixar movies, that's an element of Up that everyone talks about with critical acclaim, as they should. It's a phenomenal introduction to the film and really helps explain why Carl is where he is. It does... Bee had a fun family and then she didn't. But then where this film, I think, goes too far, but not far enough at the same time, is that her dad is also sick, which is why she goes to live with her grandma. And I don't think the film really addresses if she's having a crisis because of her dad dying or not dying, because of when those things happen. It appears as if that is the reason, but at the same time it's not, because the imaginary friend that she bumps into that was her grandmother's, whose name is Blossom, was constantly trying to be seen by her grandmother because it was her imaginary friend, and essentially if they're not remembered to some degree, they disappear forever, which is quite tragic. And I don't actually remember if we see it happen, but that's the mission of the movie. An element that has been discussed on some podcasts that was a similar thought to mine, but I never shared it in fear that I would spoil things for other people, which is that the big twist is that Ryan Reynolds, not only is he an imaginary friend but he was Bee's. And the first sign to me that this was the case, which is we see Bee in these particular pants, suit pants with suspenders, and that exact fabric and style of pant with suspenders is worn by Ryan Reynolds the very first time that we see him. And the only reason I knew to look for that was because of a story I heard about a costume designer going to see The Sixth Sense and realizing that Bruce Willis, well, spoilers for The Sixth Sense, I guess, never changed clothes, which I thought was really interesting and something that was present in my mind while watching this. Again, things I really liked about this movie, the rapport between Cailey Fleming and Ryan Reynolds is so fun and it's so charming, and the devastation that he has in not really wanting to establish this universe, being somebody who is more like an actual person in design of the imaginary friend as opposed to the different wild creatures we get to see. I hope you enjoyed the melting marshmallow sound clip leading into spoilers. That was a really funny moment in the film that I quite enjoyed, where we get to see almost an audition or introduction or interview of all the imaginary friends and how Bee is going to help us establish them with a new kid so that way they can be remembered and not disappear into nothing, I guess. But I mean, the laws of matter, you can never destroy matter, it just changes. So what do they change into? I don't know, I'm not a scientist. Neil deGrasse Tyson would probably ruin this movie too. It's not fun, Neil, stop doing it. But back to the movie, and so I like that dynamic. And my favorite joke, I think, of the whole movie was that throughout the movie there's this runner or continuous joke that Keith is an invisible imaginary friend, and who would invent that? And at the very end of the film, we learn that it's John Krasinski's character, Bee's dad, and his youthful energy kind of helps explain why he would always remember it, because even in the state that he is in, potentially going to die and leading to the surgery he's going to have, he's always constantly trying to make Bee happy. Is he overcompensating potentially because of the death of Bee's mom and his wife? Not sure, it's not really explored, and that's something that you could potentially do in live action, is give more of the drama. That's an element that I feel the film is missing. The heartwarmingness and seeing a sad little girl, I know that's going to work for me. I'm a dad of a 6-year-old, so that really did play with my heartstrings. But a lot of these elements are not going to be things we haven't seen before, and the way that they're presented, while fun, are not overly unique. You need to still be a kid, don't grow up. These are nice messages to include in your film, but as I mentioned in this non-spoiler section, if you're gonna lead for wanting to be a Pixar-style movie, you've got to, if you're gonna tell us that, you've got to do it on that level. So what if, honestly, pile on the trauma. It would have been better if maybe Ryan Reynolds was John Krasinski's imaginary friend, who was maybe based off his dead brother. Make it more sad, so I want to cry, not want to cry, but I cry at the end. Most Pixar films manage to do that to me. Not that it's a problem, the emotion that they present affects me on a biological level or a physical level. I don't science. I cried when I went to see Elemental. This film was nice and heartwarming, but it doesn't feel as if it measures up to a lot of other kids or family-friendly films, and that's unfortunate. Ultimately, it's more zany than it is emotional. It's fun, but a lot of the rules don't necessarily make sense. We get to see that Bee can kind of control everything with her imagination, but we don't see a lot of other kids experiencing the same thing as her, which would have added maybe a more interesting dynamic where they're both kids are imagining different things and how that's affecting the world around them. Maybe that would have been really cool. The auditions of the random characters is quite fun. You hear a lot of familiar voices, and I don't want to be coming off as too not critical. I mean, that's why I'm here, to talk about how I feel about the film. It's a subjective piece of dialogue coming from me only. There's no guests this week, but I was quite disappointed. I expected more from the story, and on the levels of exploration, it's not that it's shallow, but it's not very deep. It's nice. I can see why John wanted to make this based on the relationships he has with his kids, but I mean, I would show my kids other films before I would show them this. So I think that kind of speaks to itself. There's not a ton to talk about, honestly. Like, there's some really nice moments with some of the imaginary characters. Louis Gossett Jr., who passed away very recently as Teddy the Bear, was really nice. Or Louis the Teddy Bear was really nice. But other than that, I wish we spent more time with John's... I don't even think what is his name? He doesn't have a name. But B's dad, when he was in the film, that shocked me because I did not know he was going to be in it. But going back to that relationship that we spent so little time with would really help hammer home the fact that B wants to grow up and wants nothing to do with being a kid because of the things she's dealt with. But she spends so much time on her own with the imaginary friends. I feel like that message gets lost a little. So the movie's fine. I would say check it out when it hits streaming. I wouldn't run to the theater to go and see this, which is fine at the end of the day, but it's another film from John Krasinski. I don't think it's going to be a definitive film from John Krasinski. Let's move into listener questions. Listener answers from the previous week's question of the week, and you can find out what I'm reviewing next and what next week's question of the week is. Last week's question of the week was, what was your favorite film in the Planet of the Apes franchise? So answers we got was from Dylan Pollock. I'm sure I'll agree with most and say if the new movies, Dawn is by far my favorite. Upon rewatching the three, I'd say Rise is second and War is third. War just feels a little more closed off than the rest do. Feels like it affects everything fair, and can't wait to hear about X-Men 97. Well, Dylan, if you're listening to this, I'm hoping you did not skip my X-Men 97 review. Scotty Cameron, the original, the 1960s film, I've seen it, and the terrible 2001 remake with Mark Wahlberg, so the original wins by default. Well, Scotty, I could recommend something else, but just watch all four of the new ones. They're all worth watching, and I ranked them on last week's episode of the podcast. Stephanie wrote in, maybe it's an unpopular opinion, but Rise, interesting. I love a good origin story, but Dawn is undeniably amazing, so it's a tie. No, it's not a tie. You said Rise. So we're going to take that as Rise. My favorite is Dawn, although War for me gets better and better with more and more rewatches. Because of the marketing campaign for If, this week's question of the week is, what is your favorite Pixar film? So from Toy Story all the way through to Elemental. Was that their most recent film? I feel like it was. I don't think I've reviewed anything else. And with Inside Out 2 coming out, that is a big deal. Was it? Yeah, Elemental. So that was last year. So Inside Out 2 is coming out. Maybe that's your favorite when that comes out. Maybe I could have saved this question for that episode, but I didn't. So what's done is done. Thank you for listening to the Film Realist podcast. My name is Kyle Naranya. If you liked this show and want to share it with your film-loving friends, that would be great. If you haven't already, please like the podcast on your platform or follow it. Leave a 5-star review. If you would like to answer the question of the week, you can email the podcast, filmreelistspod@gmail.com, or comment on the social media post of question of the week. If you like trailer reactions, they're posted in full on TikTok and Instagram. or cut up into shorts on YouTube Shorts, because those can only be a minute long. Thank you for listening to the Film Realist Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time.